know, there's a lot of concern in politics in Canada and the rest of the Western world now about issues like declining social capital, lack of citizen engagement, voters being misled by alternative facts, and generally a lack of consensus about how to solve our common problems. And there's no magic bullet for all of that, but there is at least one ray of hope in an emerging public engagement industry. And even though you may not have heard of that industry before, so you might think this is all a bunch of startups, Mass LVP is not a startup. Peter started the company about a decade ago, and they've already done dozens of programs, contracts, consultations for governments and NGOs in several provinces. So I'm very excited that Peter is here to speak to us today, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Now, the only challenge here is that I need to be looking at the slides, and I suspect you might like to look at them as well. So someone's going to push a button in a moment or so. So why don't I just try and make a start of it, but we are going to need to revert to script at some point. It was a really lovely thing when I actually was able to reconnect with Heather. She and I have a very, I guess, unusual common experience that we shared well more than a decade ago. And as I think everyone is aware, she is a political scientist by training in addition to a lawyer. And that she and I were involved with the work of the Ontario Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And that's going to be kind of central to some of the work that I'm going to try and describe to you over the course of the next 40 or so minutes. It was not only a treat to kind of reconnect with Heather, but also quite heartening to learn a little bit more about the commitment that LexisNexis has to the rule of law. I am not a lawyer. I am a much more comfortable in the world of politics and democratic theory. But I think the intersection between these concerns about the rule of law in my world is really around a question of democratic norms. And so even though I've got, mercifully now, this slide with this very playful, childlike image on it, that shouldn't confuse you that beneath this kind of simple and hopefully entertaining illustration, there's some very important political commitments that we're trying to advance through our work. And it's true, it's unbelievable, but we've been at it for more than a decade at this point. What I want to do is talk a little bit about politics, but without talking about the sorts of things that are often part and parcel of a political conversation. What's happening at Queen's Park, what's going in Ottawa, who's up and who's down. I want to talk about a kind of everyday politics and how our experience of public institutions goes a long way to shaping the sorts of confidences we have in our public services and in our collective capacity as a society. And again, those are some of the concerns that we've tried to pursue through what have now been 200 plus projects with all different parts of the public sector across Canada. Fundamental to all of the work, though, is this idea that we're living at a moment, not only in Canada, but certainly amongst all mature, largely Western democratic societies, where the basis of democracy seems to be very much under pressure. I'll show you just a few slides to illustrate this better. And I want to disabuse you at the beginning that this is not just because of Facebook. And it's not just because of Vladimir Putin either. There's a lot more going on, and it's been going on for some time. I expect folks working at LexisNexis are a fairly bookish bunch. So let me just bring up a few titles that help to illustrate what has been a kind of slow burn of a story around our democratic settlement. You know, I'm a great fan of the transplanted New Yorker Jane Jacobs, who made the latter part of her career here in Toronto. And many people are familiar with her great book on urban planning, The Death and Life of American Cities, which, while a very critical book, was a fundamentally hopeful book about how we can create more vibrant communities. But when she died in about 2005 or 2006, it was just after the publication of what would be her last book. And I thought at the time, this is so sad, this is so unfortunate. This woman who has always had a good thing to say about how we can do things better is really going out on a low note, saying we're entering a new dark age, and 5 of the major pillars that hold up this democratic compact are crumbling. Our commitment to science, the rigor and objectivity of scholarship, the integrity of our public services and beyond. And I thought, oh, that's too bad. She really got quite sour in her last years. Then Richard Wilkinson, one of the foremost epidemiologists, consolidating a lot of work of Michael Marmot, comes out with his theory of everything that says, you really want to understand why things are getting so difficult, you actually have to look at the relationship between economic inequality and health outcomes. And we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. And then Tony Judt, the great historian of the post-war period, well, his final book, before he kicks it, is called Ill Fares the Land, right? So like this drumbeat of pessimism is almost impossible to ignore. And then, of course, we get up to this doorstopper of the book, Thomas Piketty, who puts out an 800-page tome chronicling the concentration of wealth in the 17th and 18th centuries in France, and it becomes a bestseller, right? And his concern is, we're right back to where we were when things got pretty difficult. So you don't have to squint too hard in looking at the covers of these books to see that, like, the warning signs haven't been flashing amber, they're flashing red. And then just in the last couple of years, these sort of like broad stroke analyses of wealth, of health, of fundamental institutions are replaced by outright polemics saying democracy's in trouble. Well, let's just go back a little bit to Piketty, or to rather Wilkinson, because if you're not familiar with his book, The Spirit Level, I really encourage you to take a look at it. The spirit level is a Britishism for a carpenter's level, right? And the spirit level is the fluid in the center and the little air bubble that travels back and forth. And basically he says, the most successful, most innovative, most prosperous, and healthiest societies are those which are most equal. And if you take a composite measure of all the things that we value in society, we want people to live a long and healthy life. We want them to be literate and numerate. We want children to get past the first months of life. We want people not to be living in fear that they're going to be attacked or harmed in the street. We want people to be healthy. We want them to trust their neighbors. If we assemble all of this data into a kind of universal measure, and then we take something like the Gini coefficient that measures inequality in a society, and we line up the OECD, what do we get? We get the United States at one end, the most unequal of major industrialized societies, that also struggles with all of these same measures. And the United States is interesting because you have the best and worst of everything contained in one society. A friend of mine always reminds me that look, like, it's still the home to the single largest population of like social democrats in the world. They're just thinly distributed. Right? And then you get, exactly where you might expect to find Canada. In the middle, right? A friend of mine likes to say we're We're European software running on North American hardware, which maybe explains why it doesn't always compute. I don't know. But then down here, of course, you see the Scandinavian countries. You see the Nordics. And I think we labor under a lot of really dated assumptions about Scandinavia as this kind of turgid welfare state, rather than the incredibly vibrant modern societies they've become. So one of the challenges for Canada, of course, is that we keep moving in the wrong direction on this. And it's not just your paychecks that are compounding the problem, it's wealth. And this is Thomas Piketty's concerns. You know, these are called the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 great years in the post-war period, where really we created a North American and European middle class. And we did it with the sorts of things that seem politically impossible today. You know, marginal tax rates in the 80, 90 plus percent. We did it with, strong, I know that Unifor's building is just across the parking lot. We did it with a strong labor movement. There were major economic settlements that were achieved that made this sort of shared prosperity possible. And these lines here, they just show the US, the UK, France, and Sweden. And it's about the top 1% income share and its concentration in the population. And what we can see, of course, is that we're headed right back to the kind of Gatsby era. And I think intuitively we sense this in our politics. I had a drink last week with somebody who used to work at Loblaws. And she said she has a kind of pocket theory of everything being explained by grocery consumption. And it's not crazy. She said, no frills? No frills was a 1970s invention. No frills was about the oil crisis. And suddenly people feeling really constrained and not wanting to pay, more. So we'll get rid of the packaging, we'll go with house brands. And then in the go-go 1980s, what do we get? We get President's Choice, and now everybody's supposed to have like dark chocolate and olive oil. And look at the words that were used by Loblaws then. It was the ultimate everything, the decadent cookie, right? And look at the kind of grocery experience in Toronto right now, because it corresponds really well with what a U of T Professor David Olchanski has demonstrated so potently in his research, that we're a city that's no longer the kind of great North American middle class. We are an hourglass, right? Where there are a lot of rich people and there are a lot of poor people, and that middle class is getting constrained. And so now we're a city of pussateries and Whole Foods and food basics and no frills, right? And that middle, right, like Dominions or Sobeys or whatever, they're making choices as companies to contract their kind of mainstream middle offering and either going up market or down market, right? So we see this in our everyday lives. And we can't pretend that it doesn't have political significance either. This year the Edelman Trust Barometer got a lot of press, and this is an older slide from 2017. Suffice to say that things continued to move in the wrong direction, but 2017 was important because Canada has traditionally been regarded as a high trust society, and in many respects we still are. But this was the year in which we actually fell middle of the pack, just like our friend Wilkinson suggests, but now this is about trust and our institutions. The percentage of people who believe that the system, however you might define it, just isn't working. Right? Well, there's another really interesting measure of this. You can break it up into NGOs and businesses and media and government, and you see these fairly precipitous declines between 2016 and 2017. Fully 10% of the population believing that 10% less of the population believing that government isn't working. And the slide that I find most alarming is this one, where they said, okay, let's not just look at the population as an average. Let's separate it between an elite, our friends at Pussateries, and everyone else at Food Basics. Now, how do they feel about the ways in which the system is working and not working. And, Canada, insofar as its work, has managed to. We're a very complicated, federalized society because that relationship has generally been fairly compressed, right? Like, even if the economics are changing, that kind of Canadian Tire, Tim Hortons sensibility is held, right? Mainstream, middle class values, all the rest. Except now, a sizable share of the population feels that it's just not working, so it's doubled. And you might say, well, 15%, whatever. Except that if you look at the largest gaps in our kind of three-peer countries, we're getting dangerously close to the same territory. So in France, the divide between elites and the rest, in terms of public confidence, about 18%. In the UK, it's 19%. And in the US, it's 21%. And of course, these are societies that have been dealing with the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, Brexit, and Trump. So when Michael Adams comes out with a book that says, could it happen here? And he says no. I say quite respectfully, as a member of the Environics board, actually, yes, it can happen here, and yes, it is happening here, and we've reached that tipping point where things can change very, very fast. So, just to summarize, and this will conclude what is a very dispiriting and gloomy picture, and then I'm going to try and say something helpful, positive. We are all laboring under a time of growing inequality, which Wilkinson calls a generalized form of social cancer, where we know levels of anxiety are rising. A study of teenagers in the US and the UK showed that there had been a doubling of anxiety amongst high school students within a 30-year period. And if you're parents, you might have a sense that this is the case. I mean, one of the most pressing issues on our university and college campuses right now is mental health, right? So where did that come from? Questions of belonging. Robert Putnam famously, 25 years ago, started talking about social capital and the breakdown of our relationships with one another through traditional institutions like community groups and neighborhood associations and, even Little League and all the kind of small groups that stitch people together. Certainly, we're all saturated with screens and technology. We know that's remaking our social relations. But more than that, people are really anxious because, AI is going to steal all the work, right? That's what we're told. The robots are going to do the manufacturing, and the AI is going to do, like, the higher order thinking. So what of it? And we haven't even talked about climate change yet. So if you're not worried about the robots stealing your jobs, you're pretty sure that the climate's going to crash your future. And besides that, we haven't even talked about the thing which really set off the second millennium, which was 9/11. And the fact that we all have now internalized this sense of real defenselessness in the face of a kind of unknown enemy. And, I say this, mindful of the fact that this week was the 1-year anniversary of the van attack on Yonge Street. So these are not abstractions to any of us. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to travel all across the country ahead of our 150th anniversary and do something I rarely do, which are focus groups, and to talk to Canadians as to how they were feeling about the next 50 years. And what was interesting is that I kind of got the sense, well, first of all, people make a big difference, say that we're all, it's east versus west, north versus south. In fact, I think it's the narcissism of minor difference, right? Like, we're actually much more similar than dissimilar. But that everybody was kind of smiling through gritted teeth. They're like, things are okay now, it's okay, we're getting by, things have been all right, but really apprehensive about the future. And I think all of these conditions are underlying that. They're driving this apprehension. A lot of the sense-making institutions that we've traditionally relied on to help us navigate this complexity have eroded. And then, underneath all of this, we expect that somehow democracy is going to be unaffected, right? Or that it will be the bastion, right? There's a reason why we're spending $1 billion on our parliament to like chisel out all the stones and put them back in place. It's because we want it to look like it's permanent, right? We want to make it look like it's more than the 105 years old that it is since the fire, right? We want to make it seem as though it's everlasting. But it's not. Not unless we sustain it. So this thing called democracy isn't in the highest favor with people right now. People complain a lot about democracy. There's a lot to complain about. When people sort of in my world talk a lot about, well, people are apathetic or isn't it terrible they're not voting, I often say, well, that seems like fairly rational behavior, right? After all, they look at it as something that's really majoritarian, it's winner take all, it's kind of an elite sport. Now it's increasingly populist, which is just a fancy way of saying we blame other people. It's excessively partisan. You can't bear to watch question period. It's all focused on the next election cycle. It's so mannered and formalistic. Even when people are, trying to roll up their sleeves, I guess, and look approachable, like there's still this kind of pantomime to our politics, and that everything seems really win, lose, zero sum. So how is that appealing to people? So it's not, and this will be my last slide before I get to some solutions. It's not. I mean, this is Yascha Mounk, and if you haven't been reading his work, I think he's probably one of the leading voices on sort of democratic outlook. And he did a study of people who were born in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, right? So it's a generational study. And the question was simple. Do you believe it's essential to live in a democracy? Well, remarkably, people in Britain, born in the 1980s, it's fewer than a third of them believe that it's essential. So they're not going to spend $1 billion to repair Parliament because they're not convinced that the system's working, that it's doing the job it's intended to. So if you want a kind of barometer to show just how much some of the things we take for granted have been undermined, I think this is it. And I don't think, let's just dispense with this, I don't think it's something that's repaired by a kind of Historica Canada view of like, if we just teach everybody who John A. Macdonald was and we get them to question period, that they're suddenly going to rebound in their sort of confidence and enthusiasm for these institutions. There's a big difference, of course, between this generation and this generation. It's called the Second World War. All right, so against all of this, I have my small patch, which is about trying to find better ways for citizens and government to talk with one another. And, we are awash in different public sector organizations trying to consult with us about things. They hassle us on the telephone at Sunday dinner. They ping us stuff through our inboxes. If any of you subscribe to the political parties who like breathlessly say every day, Heather, comma, can you just believe what happened? Is why I need $5 too, right? Right? And the city of Toronto, probably has several dozen events a night where they're asking residents to talk about things which may be happening in their backyard. So while people may be more engaged and society has become flatter and more transparent, it doesn't seem like public engagement is equal to the task. And I don't want to just make this semantic, but it's one of the reasons why increasingly I want to talk about inclusive governance. Because if we don't find ways to get dramatically more people to far more tables than we've been able to do to date, then I'm not sure really how we recover some of this. To kind of characterize the political dynamic, we've got the public over here, which is saying, well, you don't speak for me, right? I didn't elect you. You don't know me. You don't look like me. You didn't come from where I come from. You haven't shared my experience. I reject the idea that you represent me. And you've got public servants who feel really kind of thwarted because in this kind of pressure group politics, people come at them pretending to be the quote-unquote public, and public servants say, well, you're only focused on your own needs and interests. Right? How do I know what the public interest is? And politicians are left off in this corner, totally self-deluding, saying, well, I have a mandate from the people. You know what a mandate actually is in this country? A mandate is like maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 12 voting age adults saying you should be the leader. That's what a mandate is, right? Well, one of the other graphs I could have shown is like deference, right? Deference has just fallen off the charts. So nobody's going to put up with that, right? So that's why we end up talking about social license and all these other things. We're living in a time where the house is divided. And it's not the house between the reds and the blues and the oranges and the greens. It's a house where the kind of social compact is breached and where the necessary architecture representation is starting to erode. And we keep kicking the legs out from the table, right? So we have allowed mainstream media to largely evaporate, the union membership, problematic in many respects, continued to decline. Party membership, continued to decline. And we think that we can do it by focus groups. We think we can do it by surveying people. We think we can do it by polls. But it just exacerbates this kind of us and them sensibility. So I believe, reinforced through our work at Mass, that we fundamentally need some new ways of thinking about government. We need some new ways of thinking about citizens. That we need some new metaphors. It can't be us and them. It can't be the decision makers and the decision takers. We need to find a different way to think about ourselves. And I don't know if this is it, but one of the images that I find really compelling is this idea of barn raising. I grew up in Cambridge, and Cambridge has a lot of Mennonite communities around it. It's farm folk. And I never went to a barn raising. I'm not frankly sure if they've had a barn raising there for a long time, but it's a sensibility that appeals to me because, what's interesting about a barn raising, they call it a frolic, actually. When you have a barn raising, we're all going to frolic, is that there's a division of labor, but the entire community is involved. And they're all working on something together that they recognize as being incredible importance to the one family, and then of greater value to the community as a whole. It supports the commonwealth, you might say, of that community. But someone will cut the timber, someone will raise the boards, someone will sweep, someone will tend to kids and animals and make the food, but it's a collective enterprise. And I think one of the things that maybe we're all choking for a little bit is the chance to actually be involved in something bigger than ourselves and to feel like we can apply our skills and aptitudes in a way that makes a difference for the world that's around us. And I think we find ourselves blocked often because what do political parties want us to do? Just about three things. They want us to vote, they want us to give money, and maybe join a phone bank, right? So these are supposedly the organizations in our society that should have the greatest confidence in the capacity of citizens, and they can't think of anything more monocultural for us to do than to give money to, like we've got expanded capacities that need to be tapped into. So if we're to tap into these strategies, these capacities, we need new strategies. And I think part of that is saying we need to share out this business of representation, that it's not something that can just be consolidated into the work of 130 people at Queen's Park or 338 in Ottawa. So, mindful of the time, I want to very quickly talk about three things that we've been doing that try and exemplify a different way of thinking about and working with the public. And the first is the work around reference panels. The second, what we call Civic Challenges, which I think is our best example of barn raising. And then I'll talk either about social alumni or something called service balance. This is a photo that Heather recognizes because Back in 2005, in Ontario, the government did a very outlandish thing. And this seems sadly like ancient history now. But it was the fashion of the times to deal with what was seen to be the excessive concentration of power in our parliament, in our executives, and that there were a series of democratic reforms that were proposed. Campaign finance laws, recall in BC, and the idea of changing the voting system. And it would be a whole other talk to describe why this happened. But if you can believe it, the government of the day decided to send out 100,000 letters to randomly selected households. And it asked them whether they would be willing not to come out for 3 hours on a Wednesday evening to talk about voting systems, but whether people would be prepared to give up 16 weekends over the course of a year to travel from every riding in the province to the lecture theatre at Osgoode Law School, at York University, and be part of what was called a citizens' assembly to advise government. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, 16 weekends, no thank you. But would you believe that 7,000 Ontarians volunteered? So 7% of the people who were invited offered to put their lives on hold to do this. And I think to myself, well, how many of them would have said yes, except they just enrolled in a new course, or they just gotten a new job and they really wanted to be focused, or they just had the birth of their first child, or they could make 14 of them, but their sister was getting married, and so they couldn't. What this proves is that there's significantly more public appetite for a really audacious big ask like this. And let me assure you, there are a lot of political science geeks out there who care probably too much about voting systems. There aren't 7,000 of them, and you don't find them randomly. Okay? So something else was going on here. These are the 103 members who met in that hall weekend after weekend. And what's interesting to recall is just the antipathy and hostility that they faced in the media. Because you would think, well, isn't that a great gesture of kind of civic generosity and muscle? That citizens were going to come together not because of their partisan affiliation, they weren't getting paid, this wasn't part of their career development, but they were doing it because they wanted to contribute to something they believed was important. And no less than the vaunted Toronto Star, with its precious Atkinson principles, said, these are just a bunch of people looking for some excitement in their humdrum lives. Thanks, Ian. Not to be outdone, Christina Blizzard of the Toronto Star says, these are people who have so little going on in their lives that they're prepared to spend 18 weekends discussing PR. Thanks, Christina. And bless, Professor Nelson Wiseman at the University of Toronto says, it's ridiculous. Right? I think this is probably one of the most promising examples of citizen democracy in action. A model which is actually celebrated in countries like Germany and France and Belgium and the UK right now, that has been the basis of an entire wave of democratic renewal in many of these societies. We don't know our own stories in typically Canadian fashion. Nevertheless, part of the problem is that, frankly, a lot of public consultation is useless. You can go to one of those City of Toronto meetings tonight, and what's it going to be like? A bunch of people who've already made up their minds, haranguing whomever is at the front of the room, talking in a language nobody can understand, and it's just like, any Parks and Recs fans in here? Right? They do a really good job of characterizing that dynamic. So we don't know how to do the basics right. The Citizens Assembly might be a high watermark. We let it go. But the everyday stuff we don't do well. We waste our time, we waste the public's time, we go through the motions. And by getting the basic stuff wrong, it reinforces a view of the public that is a myth. That the public is something that's really volatile and polarized and emotional and ill-informed. And if you're a good public servant, you respond to something like that in the only way you know how, as a risk to be managed, right? So what does government do? They say less, they delegate less, they constrain the opportunity for any conversation. I believe people are different. I think, you know, in the conversations we've had over these years, we see, you know, my neighbors and your neighbors to be people who are actually a little more giving, a little more curious, a little more caring, a little more kind. But we don't design any of these encounters, these public meetings, to bring out people's better angels. We believe that politics has to be adversarial. And we replicate the pathologies of the things that we don't like, because we refuse to see the public as an essential resource. We think it's something to be managed and put aside. So our work is fundamentally about recharacterizing this phantom public, use Walter Lippmann's great line, from a risk to being a resource. We have to rebalance self-interest and group interest, which is well expressed in our society, but we don't have a good way of knowing what the public interest is. So we've been trying to build off the example of the Citizens' Assembly and breaking that process into two halves, what we call a civic lottery and a reference panel. We call it a lottery because we want people to feel good about winning. And at this point, you know, we've sent not 100,000 letters to Canadians, we've sent about 300,000 letters to Canadians, inviting them to participate in one of 35 smaller citizens' assemblies or reference panels that we've done on a wide range of issues. And the incredible thing is that we have largely maintained that 4 to 7% response rate, and had more than 1,700 Canadians at this point serve in a similar capacity. So we think this is a better way to go because you get recommendations that are useful. It enhances institutional trust and transparency. Organizations have to kind of recalibrate how they think about the public. But it actually raises people's sense of self-confidence and ability, what we like to call democratic fitness. It's the Aaron Brockovich school of politics, not someone who knew how a bill became law, not someone who knew who her senator was, but someone with a sense of moral courage and personal agency and efficacy and a willingness to figure it out. That's what I think we want our citizens to be replete with. So we go through a lot of things asking people, being careful about who's in the room and how did they get there. This is an example that you will, of course, appreciate. You would never walk down University Avenue and see a sandwich board in front of a courthouse that said, "Murder trial this afternoon, jurors wanted." That would be crazy. We know exactly who would line up, right? People who would be intensely interested in the outcome of that case without knowing any of the specifics. There is a reason why Lady Justice is blind and holding the scale. Disinterest is as fundamental to good democratic politics as interest. But we keep doubling down on processes that only magnify the voices of interested parties. And so we don't have mechanisms to bring due disinterest into the equation. So that's why we do the civic lottery. Are we asking people to tell us their stories and what they like and think and want? Or are we asking them to do the thing that democracy requires? It's not counting up all the votes. It's not the crude aggregate of opinion. It's how we put ourselves in one another's shoes and try and speak for one another, not only arguing our corner. So we ask people to think about the views of others. And then we give them something real to do. Solve this problem. What services should be available in our community hospital? What investments need we make in transit infrastructure? How do we protect privacy? And not just the post-it note shit of brainstorms, right? But really substantive policy exercises. And then we help people understand the basics so that they can have an informed conversation. So we've tackled a whole range of issues here. We send out a lot of these letters. We've written a guide for how other jurisdictions can do it. And at this point, you know, it has become very quietly, in a very self-effacing, modest Canadian way, probably one of our leading democratic innovations and exports to other countries. Again, a story that's better known outside our country than within. So this is the Minister Tracy McCharles in the last government. This is Ontario. If you made it 36 people, they volunteered to give us 4 weekends over the course of a year. They largely wrote Ontario's Condominium Act. And when that act came forward to the legislature, something happened that almost never does. It passed unanimously. This is Canada. If Canada was 36 people, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention that one of the big issues going into the next federal election will be the question of pharmaceutical insurance. And this was brought together by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. 36 Canadians, half men, half women. Good deal better than our federal parliament or Queen's Park, Toronto City Council, or we could go on. Balanced by age, working in both French and English. This young woman brought her young daughter from northern Alberta down, and they worked at the Museum of Canadian History for almost a week, hearing from 20 leading experts from industry and academia, and advised government on whether and how to bring forward a plan. Recommendations that were largely accepted by the House Standing Committee on Health, and which has been wired now into the work of the Hoskins Commission. And this is closer to home. This is the GTHA if it was 36 people working at Toronto Pearson Airport. Pearson is growing a lot, puts a lot of pressure on the neighboring communities. Maybe you have overflights near your house and they keep you awake at night. People know that, at Heathrow they can't build a 3rd runway, and they don't want to at Pearson. Don't worry about that. It's not the takeaway. But there are a lot of measures they could have put in place to lower that impact. So they put these group of citizens in charge of helping them write their noise management strategy. And you'll see that the kind of demographics change as I'm moving from Canada to Ontario to Toronto. But what's important is that each of these groups is demographically representative of the communities. So at this point, we've done about 33 of these, about 300,000 households, about 30,000 hours of deliberation. And what we really want to do is get to a place in Canada where 60 of these are happening each year. If you might say, wow, you spent a decade doing 30, how are you going to get to 60 in a year? It's not that big a problem. It's actually about a $10 million problem. And we spend $10 million each year on way crazier things than this, with far less impact. But what would 60 do? It would allow each of you once in your lifetime to get one of those brown letters and maybe have the opportunity to participate. It wouldn't change or fix or solve democracy, but it would be, I think, a really nice part of our political culture if that's just how we did some of the tough stuff. Now, I'm running out of time here, and I'd love to take 2 or 3 questions. I'm just very quickly going to say about Civic Challenges. I started with this metaphor of barn raising. We've actually done a great barn raising project in this country. It's been hiding in plain sight. I think the future of politics is actually contained in this example, and it was the private settlement program for Syrian refugees. The federal government sent out a call to Canadians that said, if you're concerned about this humanitarian crisis, find 5 other families, raise $30,000, adopt a family, take responsibility for their housing, their education, finding employment. And again, these apathetic citizens who don't want to come out to a Wednesday night meeting at Town Hall said, can do. And 30,000 Canadian, or 175,000 Canadians formed those little brigades and helped settle an additional 25,000 Syrian refugees. This is not the statement that many other immigration ministers could make in the face of that crisis. So we know that there's a way to issue civic challenges that mobilize people. This shouldn't be a once-in-a-generation thing. It should be a once-in-a-mandate thing. That it's incumbent on government to think about collective action problems that people can solve. Last thing, social alumni, just want to say, isn't it kind of odd that, how many TTC users are there here? Or Mississauga My Way? Any public transit users? A few. Well, good on you. Sad thing is, in your lifetime, you're going to spend close to $100,000 in fares. And you will be no different to the TTC on the last day that you take your final trip as you were on the first day when you first put a token in the box. The relationship never changes. And I started thinking about university and alumni, and how over the course of the past 30 years, universities have gotten much more sophisticated about their alumni programs. And it's not just about the money, right? It's about lifelong learning, it's about a community attachment. How is it that we could take more of our public services and redefine the relationship so that it can grow and expand with time? There's more to be said about that, but we got started a little bit late. I've run into the Q&A time. I don't know if you can spare 5 minutes now to take a few questions, but that's kind of a tour of just about everything we've been thinking about at Mass and the source of our motivations, and trying to address the situation where, frankly, we know people want to say, but they're also willing to serve. And the challenge of our times is not that we've been asking too much of people, we've been asking too little, and we need to be more inventive in finding ways to help people live the values that I believe they hold, but are currently blocked from expressing. Stop there. Questions from either online, perhaps, or in the room? Yeah.
Have there been any studies done, or have you observed any correlation between operating reference panels and civic lotteries and a tangible change in people's confidence in democratic institutions?
We haven't done that work, but a lot of it is being done out of Australia. They're kind of parallel histories of the popularization of deliberation. And Canada and Australia are kind of sister countries. And for similar reasons, I think there's been a lot of energy on this. Anyway, something at the University of Canberra, they've got a dedicated research center which has been proving exactly that case. These are mechanisms to build greater social license, popular legitimacy for difficult political choices, but they have a meaningful impact on the individuals who are involved. And anecdotally, we've had people who spend the 4 Saturdays with us, help write a condominium act, and then on the last day they're saying things like, so how could I get more involved in my community? Or is there another one of these things I could do? And then we hear later on that, oh, they joined an advisory committee at the local hospital, and they say, I would never have thought to do this. I didn't think I had anything I could contribute.
And just another point about the reference panels. You pointed out that the ones you've conducted had excellent representation of many different demographics. But I was thinking also about the graphic you showed about how there's been a declining belief in democracy, depending on basically younger people have less confidence in it. Have you found it's more challenging to get younger people involved in these kind of reference panels, or does it really just depend on the issue that you're asking about, and different demographics might feel more or less strongly about particular issues?
Well, an organization like yours will understand the concerns we might have about liability, which is why we generally restrict these processes to 18 and over. But we don't have any trouble finding 18 to 24-year-olds proportionate to their share of the population. That said, I think it's entirely reasonable that there would be greater inclination from certain age cohorts to volunteer than others. For instance, 30-somethings who are like still in the formative years of their career, maybe they've got a new child, maybe this is not like they are not going to volunteer in the same numbers. I think we might accept as a society that that's okay, because they're going to get to do that maybe when they're 40 or 50, and that maybe there are other things, other ways for them to be involved. And the same would hold for the 12-year-olds to the 16-year-olds. There are great programs like Encounters with Canada and Katimavik and other things, ways that people can start to understand this place and make a contribution to it. But we would need to expand those programs by several orders of magnitude for them to have the necessary impact. Any other questions? Yeah.
You said the reference to your assembly
Yeah.
for instance, and to create policy and that sort of thing. How do you get from the assembly to actually creating a piece of legislation to get it through?
It's a great question, and unfortunately, I got my presentation a bit lopsided. I spent so much time describing the tale of woe here, and I spent comparatively little explaining the mechanisms of a reference panel. But there was a slide back there that talked about convene, learn, issues, values, issues, priorities, recommendations. And, you know, for us, the sort of the facilitation is incidental. Like our competency is understanding policy issues and making them intelligible to the general public. What we would do is invite people into the room if we were talking about health services and say, you know, so here's the Canada Health Act and there are 5 values to it, but what are your values for? And we'll use those values then as a group. Like we all buy into values because you're talking about kind of higher order principles. But then you got to stick with it. So now you're going to get into the details. Well, let's learn about what's going on in this hospital and the needs of the community. And then we're going to point to specific issues that we think need to be addressed as a group. And then we're going to come up with some hierarchy of those. We're going to prioritize amongst them. And then we're going to draft recommendations against those priorities. And we will have heard from a range of speakers about different interventions government could make. But they'll express all of this in their own words. And by the end, I mean, this is the thing too. We've created, I don't know how many public policy schools in the last 20 years in this country, and we've taken something that previously was not a like capital P profession. And I think we have made it seem a little more complicated than it really needs to be. You know, like full respect to people working in Treasury Board and some of like the real technical centers in government. But in terms of being able to look at something like, you know, condominium legislation and say, all right, let's think about what the governance of these things might look like. What are their strengths and weaknesses? How would we deal with the shortcomings? People are able to have an informed conversation about this relatively easily. So we work with them to develop detailed recommendations, but ultimately they're working in small groups with a facilitator, their words, their report, we get out of the way. All right, so there's a good place to end.
Okay. Peter, on behalf of LexisNexis Canada, thank you very much for spending time with us, illuminating us about the great work that you do. And while you said that you're not a lawyer, I think to fully understand the nature and significance of rule of law, one has to have some understanding of political science and economics and history and all of the subjects that you touched upon. So it was very educational for all of us. We thank you, and here's a small token of our appreciation as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming, and stay tuned for news about our forthcoming rule of law speakers.